By the final year of the Pacific War, thousands of Japanese women believed capture would strip them of dignity, safety, and humanity. They had been taught that surrender meant humiliation worse than death itself. What awaited them instead was not cruelty, but something far more disturbing. American guards who enforced control through distance, discipline, and an absence of touch. In 1945, Japan stood at the edge of total collapse. Cities burned, supply lines vanished, and entire populations were uprooted as American forces advanced across the Pacific. Among the displaced were Japanese women whose lives had been absorbed into the war effort, not by choice, but by necessity and obligation. Some worked as nurses in field hospitals carved into jungle hillsides. Others served as clerks, radio operators, or factory laborers supporting nearby garrisons. Many were civilians who had simply lived too close to military targets and were swept into retreating columns as Japanese defenses disintegrated. What united these women was not ideology, but fear. From childhood, they had been conditioned to believe that surrender to the enemy was unthinkable. American soldiers, according to official warnings and whispered rumors, were portrayed as undisciplined, violent, and incapable of restraint. Stories circulated relentlessly, describing atrocities that blurred into certainty the closer defeat became. For Japanese women, the message was unmistakable. Capture meant physical violation, public humiliation, and the loss of all dignity. These beliefs were reinforced not only through propaganda, but through lived experience inside Japan's own rigid military hierarchy, where authority was enforced through fear and punishment. As defeat approached, many women prepared themselves mentally for what they believed was inevitable. Some resolved to endure whatever came. Others quietly considered whether survival was worth the cost they expected to pay. A few carried small objects, not as weapons, but as final assurances of control over their own fate. When surrender finally occurred, it did not bring relief. It brought a heavy, suffocating silence. American troops appeared not as monsters, but as unfamiliar figures moving with practiced order. Commands were given calmly. Weapons were carried low. Guards stood back rather than crowding forward. For women who had prepared themselves for immediate brutality, this behavior felt deeply unsettling. They waited for shouting that never came. They braced themselves for violence that did not arrive. And they watched, confused and fearful, as hours passed without the touch they had been taught to dread most. What followed was not the confirmation of their fears, but the slow collapse of a belief system built on terror. A realization that restraint could be more destabilizing than cruelty, and that the enemy they had been taught to fear did not behave as expected at all. This was the shock that would stay with many of them for the rest of their lives. The moment of surrender did not unfold in a single dramatic instant, but rather as a slow and disorienting process that unfolded differently for each group of Japanese women. Some were captured as organized units dissolved under American pressure, while others were found hiding in caves, abandoned buildings, or makeshift shelters after fighting had moved on. In nearly every case, the women expected the same outcome: immediate brutality followed by humiliation. Instead, they encountered something unfamiliar and deeply confusing. American soldiers approached cautiously, not with raised voices or wild gestures, but with controlled movements shaped by training and repetition. Weapons remained visible, yet were rarely pointed directly at the women unless a genuine threat was perceived. Orders were delivered through interpreters when available, or through deliberate hand signals that left little room for misunderstanding. The atmosphere was tense, but not chaotic, and for women conditioned to associate authority with violence, this restraint felt unnatural. Searches were conducted methodically. Personal belongings were inspected, weapons confiscated, and names recorded whenever possible. Yet physical contact was limited to what was absolutely necessary. Guards avoided grabbing arms or forcing movement unless resistance occurred, and even then, force was measured rather than explosive. In several documented cases, American personnel stepped back deliberately to allow women to walk forward on their own rather than pushing them from behind. For the prisoners, this behavior did not immediately register as safety. On the contrary, many interpreted it as a calculated deception. Years of wartime indoctrination had taught them that cruelty could be delayed for psychological effect, and that restraint was often used to lower defenses before abuse began. As a result, the absence of violence intensified fear rather than easing it. Women waited for the inevitable shift in behavior. They anticipated that discipline would collapse once initial control was established. They braced themselves for the moment guards would lose patience, assert dominance, and confirm every warning they had been given since childhood. Yet as time passed, no such transformation occurred. Instead of being isolated or intimidated, they were organized into groups and escorted to temporary holding areas. These locations were often improvised, using existing structures or cleared sections of captured terrain, but they were governed by clear rules. Movement was restricted but explained. Boundaries were enforced but consistently. Guards maintained physical distance even when issuing instructions, choosing to repeat commands rather than close in aggressively. Medical checks followed, particularly for women who appeared injured, exhausted, or malnourished. Whenever possible, female American medical staff were assigned to conduct examinations. When that was not possible, procedures were explained in advance, sometimes through interpreters, sometimes through gestures and repetition, with an emphasis on clarity rather than speed. Privacy was imperfect, but effort was made to preserve dignity in ways the prisoners had not expected. This approach clashed sharply with the women's expectations. In their experience, authority did not explain itself. Orders were meant to be obeyed instantly, and failure was punished without warning. Here, however, discipline appeared structured, regulated, and restrained by rules the guards themselves followed. The women did not trust this system. They watched closely, searching for signs of weakness or impending cruelty. They observed the guards' expressions, their tone, their interactions with one another. They noticed that misconduct was corrected, sometimes sharply, by higher-ranking personnel. They saw guards reprimanded for unnecessary roughness, and this internal discipline unsettled them more than violence would have. Violence could be explained within the framework they understood. Restraint could not. As night fell on the first day of captivity, many women slept lightly, expecting the situation to change under cover of darkness. Some remained awake entirely, convinced that the absence of abuse was temporary. Yet morning came without incident, and then another day followed, marked by the same controlled routines and careful distance. The shock was not immediate, but cumulative. Each hour without cruelty chipped away at the expectations they had carried into captivity. Each interaction that remained formal rather than violent forced them to confront the possibility that what they had been taught about the enemy might not be entirely true. This realization did not bring comfort. It brought uncertainty, confusion, and a profound psychological tension that would shape their experience in captivity far more deeply than fear alone. The confusion that followed capture did not exist in a vacuum. It was rooted in years of conditioning that shaped how Japanese women understood authority, power, and survival during wartime. To grasp the depth of their shock, one must first understand the system that had prepared them for a completely different reality. Imperial Japan operated on a rigid hierarchy in which obedience was enforced through fear rather than consent. From schools to factories, and especially within military environments, Discipline was maintained through physical punishment, public humiliation, and constant surveillance. Women attached to military units, whether as nurses, clerks, or auxiliary workers, lived under strict control where mistakes were not corrected quietly, but punished visibly. Authority was not distant or procedural. It was immediate, physical, and often unpredictable. Within this structure, touch carried meaning. It was not neutral. It was a tool used to assert dominance, enforce obedience, and remind individuals of their place within the hierarchy. Even outside formal punishment, proximity itself was a form of control. Superiors stood close, watched closely, and intervened physically whenever they deemed it necessary. As a result, Japanese women associated authority with intrusion. They expected guards to close distance deliberately, to crowd space, and to use physical presence as a weapon. This expectation followed them into captivity, shaping every moment of fear they experienced during surrender. American discipline functioned on an entirely different logic. Instead of relying on fear to maintain order, American military structure emphasized procedure, documentation, and accountability. Guards were expected to follow regulations as strictly as prisoners were expected to obey them. Deviations from protocol were not signs of strength, but failures of discipline subject to correction. For the women in captivity, this distinction was difficult to process. They had been taught that power revealed itself through cruelty and that restraint signaled weakness or deception. When American guards enforced rules without raising their voices or asserting physical dominance, the women struggled to interpret what they were witnessing. Some believed it was a test. Others suspected it was a temporary phase meant to lull them into compliance. A few assumed it was a matter of time before exhaustion or frustration would push the guards toward violence. Days passed without confirmation of these fears. The consistency of behavior became its own source of tension. Guards maintained distance not only during routine supervision, but even in moments where force might have seemed justified. When a woman hesitated or misunderstood an instruction, the response was repetition rather than punishment. When frustration appeared, it was directed inward through clipped language or tightened posture rather than outward through physical aggression. This consistency forced the prisoners to confront a disturbing possibility. If restraint was genuine, then the stories they had believed for years were fundamentally flawed. Accepting this idea required dismantling a worldview built on fear, and that process was neither quick nor painless. Many women responded by clinging more tightly to their expectations. They interpreted neutral actions as hidden threats and waited for proof that their instincts had been correct all along. Others withdrew emotionally, choosing to observe without engaging, conserving energy for an ordeal they still believed was coming. Yet, even among those who remained distrustful, cracks began to form. The absence of random punishment altered behavior within the camp. Women began to move with slightly less tension, to sleep more deeply, and to speak more openly among themselves. Fear remained, but it was no longer sharp. It became dull, persistent, and confusing. This emotional shift was subtle, unfolding gradually rather than dramatically. There was no moment when the women declared themselves safe. Instead, there was a slow realization that something fundamental had changed, even if they could not yet name it. The greatest burden was not fear of harm, but uncertainty about meaning. If the enemy did not behave as expected, then the moral clarity of the war began to dissolve. Questions emerged that had no easy answers. Why had they been warned so intensely? Why had surrender been framed as worse than death? And what did it mean if restraint, rather than cruelty, defined their captivity? These questions lingered unspoken, shaping every interaction and every quiet moment in the camp. They marked the beginning of a psychological transformation that would deepen as captivity continued, forcing the women to confront not only their captors, but the beliefs that had guided their lives until that point. As captivity settled into routine, Japanese women began to understand that the absence of violence was not an isolated coincidence, but a structural feature of the system in which they now lived. Days unfolded according to schedules that were strict yet predictable, creating a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the constant uncertainty they had known before surrender. Morning inspections occurred at fixed hours. Meals arrived at consistent times. Movement within the camp followed clearly defined rules that were enforced the same way each day. For women accustomed to arbitrary punishment and shifting expectations, this regularity felt deeply unsettling because it removed the familiar logic of fear and replaced it with something more difficult to interpret. Guards maintained watch continuously, yet rarely intruded physically. They observed from a distance, positioning themselves where they could see without looming close. Even during roll calls or inspections, they stood back rather than crowding forward, allowing space to remain between authority and prisoner. This physical distance carried psychological weight, signaling a form of control that relied on structure rather than intimidation. Sleeping quarters were monitored, but not invaded without cause. Guards announced their presence before entering enclosed spaces, and inspections were conducted swiftly and formally. Women noticed that guards avoided unnecessary movement through personal areas, choosing instead to enforce compliance through visibility and repetition rather than proximity. This constant watchfulness without touch created a paradoxical environment. The women were never free, yet they were not physically dominated. They lived under control, but not under assault. Over time, this distinction began to reshape their internal state, altering how fear manifested within them. Initially, many remained tense, interpreting restraint as a prelude to delayed cruelty. They slept lightly, startled by footsteps or voices, expecting restraint to give way to violence at any moment. However, as days turned into weeks, the anticipated shift failed to occur. No pattern emerged that suggested a breakdown of discipline or a hidden agenda. Instead, consistency persisted. Medical care, when needed, followed the same logic. Treatment was administered with explanation rather than force, and physical contact occurred only when necessary for care. Women suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, or illness were attended to without humiliation, and the procedures were carried out with an emphasis on efficiency rather than dominance. This approach deeply conflicted with the prisoners' understanding of authority. In their previous experience, control was demonstrated through unpredictability, reinforcing obedience by keeping individuals off balance. Here, control was demonstrated through reliability, which paradoxically reduced panic while increasing confusion. As the environment stabilized, subtle changes appeared among the women. Conversations became quieter and more reflective rather than purely fearful. Some began to sleep more soundly, their bodies responding instinctively to the absence of immediate threat, even as their minds resisted the idea of safety. Others found themselves watching the guards with a different kind of attention, no longer searching solely for danger, but for patterns and consistency. The lack of physical intrusion forced the women to confront their own expectations. Without violence to react against, fear had nowhere to discharge itself. Instead, it turned inward, manifesting as emotional fatigue and cognitive dissonance. They were trapped between what they had been taught to expect and what they were actually experiencing. For many, this tension proved more exhausting than fear alone. Violence could be endured as an external force, but contradiction demanded internal reconciliation. Each day, without abuse, challenged beliefs that had shaped their identity and survival strategies throughout the war. The guards, often unaware of the psychological impact of their restraint, continued to enforce rules without deviation. Their consistency acted as a quiet pressure, gradually eroding the prisoners' assumptions without offering clear explanations. This absence of explanation left the women to interpret events on their own, creating a slow and deeply personal reckoning. By the end of the first weeks, it became clear that captivity was not following the script they had prepared themselves for. The shock was no longer about immediate survival, but about meaning. The women were forced to ask themselves whether the enemy they feared was real or whether fear itself had been weaponized long before they ever encountered an American guard. This realization marked a turning point, setting the stage for deeper psychological consequences that would surface as captivity continued, reshaping not only how these women viewed their captors, but how they understood the war, their nation, and their own place within it. As captivity continued, the absence of physical abuse did not bring simple relief. Instead, it produced a psychological strain that many Japanese women struggled to articulate, even to themselves. The human mind, conditioned for years to expect cruelty, does not easily accept restraint as reality. When violence fails to appear, fear does not disappear, it transforms. For many women, restraint became heavier than threat. Each day, without punishment, forced them to confront the possibility that the enemy they had been taught to fear did not exist in the form they had imagined. This realization was not comforting. It was destabilizing. It undermined the mental framework that had allowed them to endure years of war, sacrifice, and obedience. Inside the camps, women began to experience a slow erosion of certainty. If American guards were capable of discipline without cruelty, then the moral clarity of the war narrative began to fracture. The idea that surrender automatically meant dishonor and degradation no longer aligned with lived experience. Yet abandoning that belief required acknowledging that much of what they had been told was either exaggerated or false. This internal conflict manifested in different ways. Some women felt anger, not toward their captors, but toward the system that had prepared them so thoroughly for suffering that never came. Others experienced guilt, ashamed that they had believed the propaganda so completely, or that they now felt a sense of relief in captivity. For a few, the contradiction triggered a deep emotional numbness, as if the mind had shut down to avoid processing incompatible realities. The guard's restraint amplified this psychological pressure precisely because it was consistent. There were no outbursts to rationalize, no moments of cruelty to confirm fear. Authority remained impersonal and procedural. Orders were enforced through repetition and structure, not intimidation. Even disciplinary actions followed formal processes rather than spontaneous punishment. This predictability removed a coping mechanism the women had relied on throughout the war. Under violent authority, survival strategies are clear: obey, endure, and wait for suffering to pass. Under restrained authority, the absence of immediate threat leaves space for reflection, and reflection brings doubt. Many women began to replay memories of their training, the warnings they had received, and the stories they had internalized. They questioned why such extreme fear had been instilled in them and what purpose it had served. Some recalled lectures that framed surrender as moral collapse, insisting that death was preferable to capture. Now, confronted with captivity that preserved dignity rather than destroying it, those teachings felt hollow and cruel. This psychological strain extended beyond ideology into identity. For women whose sense of worth had been tied to endurance and sacrifice, the lack of suffering created confusion. If survival did not require constant pain, then what did their endurance mean? What had they been prepared to die for, and why? Restraint also altered interpersonal dynamics within the prisoner community. Without violence to unite them against a common threat, tensions surfaced in quieter ways. Differences in belief, background, and experience became more visible. Some women accepted the new reality more quickly, while others clung to expectations of cruelty as a form of emotional protection. These differences created subtle divisions, shaping conversations and silences alike. At the same time, the guards remained largely unaware of the psychological impact of their behavior. Their goal was order, not introspection. They followed regulations, maintained distance, and avoided unnecessary contact, unaware that this restraint was forcing prisoners into a profound internal reckoning. For many Japanese women, the true burden of captivity was not fear of harm, but the slow collapse of certainty. Restraint stripped away the simple narrative of victim and monster, replacing it with ambiguity that demanded emotional adaptation. This ambiguity lingered, pressing heavily on the mind, and prepared the ground for changes that would follow once the war itself came to an end. When news of Japan's surrender finally reached the camps, it did not arrive with celebration or clarity. For many Japanese women, the end of the war felt distant and unreal, overshadowed by months of psychological tension that had already reshaped their understanding of captivity, authority, and survival. The absence of violence had altered them in ways they were only beginning to grasp. As administrative procedures shifted from wartime control to post-war processing, American oversight remained largely unchanged in tone and behavior. Guards continued to enforce rules through structure rather than force, and interactions remained formal, distant, and regulated. This continuity reinforced a realization that many women had resisted throughout captivity. Restraint had never been temporary. It had been deliberate. For some prisoners, this realization brought a quiet sense of relief. The fear they had carried for years began to loosen its grip, allowing exhaustion to surface fully for the first time. Bodies that had remained tense in anticipation of abuse now responded to the absence of threat, revealing how deeply fear had shaped their physical and emotional state. Sleep became heavier. Movements slowed. Conversations turned inward, reflective rather than guarded. For others, however, the end of the war intensified inner conflict. If surrender had not led to the horrors they were promised, then the sacrifices demanded of them before capture felt increasingly senseless. The idea that death had been framed as preferable to survival now appeared cruel and unnecessary. This realization did not erase loyalty or identity overnight, but it introduced doubt that could not be dismissed. As preparations for repatriation began, Japanese women faced a new uncertainty. Returning home meant re-entering a society that had taught them to fear captivity more than death. Yet they now carried experiences that contradicted that lesson. Many wondered how their survival would be judged, and whether the truth of their treatment would be believed at all. Some women chose silence, deciding that the complexity of their experience was too difficult to explain. Others attempted to speak openly, only to find that restraint did not fit neatly into the narratives of suffering and heroism that dominated post-war memory. Stories of kindness or professionalism were often met with disbelief, discomfort, or dismissal. The psychological impact of captivity lingered long after physical freedom was restored. For many women, the absence of abuse had forced a reckoning not only with the enemy, but with the system that had prepared them for terror that never came. The shock was not erased by liberation. It followed them home, shaping how they understood authority, truth, and the cost of obedience. In later years, some women reflected that the most difficult part of captivity was not fear of harm, but the collapse of certainty. They had survived not by enduring brutality, but by confronting contradiction. This confrontation left marks that were quieter than physical wounds, yet no less enduring. The American guards who had never touched them faded into memory as symbols of a reality they had never been taught to imagine. Their restraint became a dividing line between expectation and experience, forcing a generation of women to question the narratives that had governed their lives. When the war ended, captivity ended with it. But the shock endured, not as trauma inflicted by violence, but as a lingering awareness that truth, once exposed, cannot be unlearned. For many Japanese women, captivity did not end when the barbed wire disappeared or when ships finally carried them home. What followed was not simply freedom, but a long and difficult process of understanding what they had lived through. The shock they experienced was not rooted in violence, but in contradiction, and contradictions are far more difficult to resolve than fear. They had entered captivity prepared for humiliation and physical harm, convinced that surrender would strip them of dignity and humanity. Instead, they encountered a system governed by restraint, procedure, and distance. American guards enforced control without intrusion, authority without domination, and discipline without cruelty. This reality did not erase the pain of war, but it dismantled the narrative that had shaped their expectations since childhood. The absence of touch became symbolic. It represented more than professionalism or military regulation. It exposed the fragile foundations of wartime propaganda and forced these women to confront the idea that fear had been weaponized long before they ever faced the enemy. What unsettled them most was not how they were treated, but why they had been taught to expect something entirely different. Upon returning to Japan, many women found little space to articulate this experience. Post-war society often preferred clear stories of suffering and heroism, leaving no room for accounts that challenged established beliefs. Some women remained silent, carrying their confusion privately. Others attempted to speak, only to discover that restraint did not fit comfortably into collective memory. Yet the impact of their experience endured. For some, it reshaped how they understood authority, teaching them that power did not always reveal itself through violence. For others, it left a lingering sense of betrayal toward the system that had demanded unquestioning obedience while preparing them for horrors that never came. The war had ended, but the process of reevaluating truth and belief continued quietly for decades. This story is not one of absolution or condemnation. It is a reminder that war distorts reality on every side, not only through destruction, but through narratives designed to control fear. For these women, survival did not come from enduring brutality, but from confronting a reality that defied everything they had been told. In the end, the most enduring wound was not inflicted by a guard or a weapon. It was the realization that certainty, once broken, cannot be restored. The American guards who never touched them became a symbol of that fracture, a quiet reminder that truth is often more unsettling than violence, and that the deepest shocks of war are sometimes the ones no one prepares for at all. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.